Hi everybody. Today we'll be looking at one of the most tumultuous and chaotic periods in American history, the decade of the 1960s. And it's impossible to talk about the 60s without at least one gratuitous Hendrix photo. So here we go, right on the cover. Picture of Jimi Hendrix setting his guitar on fire at the 1967 Monterey Pop Festival in San Francisco. So, had to get that out of my system. More than any other single event, the Greensboro sit-ins launched what we know as the 60s. It was on the afternoon of February 1st, 1960 that 4 students from North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University, a black college in Greensboro, entered their local Woolworth's department store. After making a few purchases, they sat down at the lunch counter, an area that was reserved exclusively for whites, as we see them here in our first photograph. Told that they could not be served, they remained in their seats until the store closed. They returned the next morning and the next. After resisting for 5 months, Woolworths in July 1960 finally agreed to serve black customers at its lunch counters. The success sparked similar demonstrations across the South in the months that followed. Activists began demanding not just access to lunch counters, but access to public parks, pools, restaurants, bowling alleys, libraries, and other facilities. By the end of 1960, some 70,000 demonstrators had taken part in what became known as the sit-in movement. Angry whites often assaulted them, but having been trained in nonviolent resistance, the protesters did not strike back. With their freedom rides, freedom schools, freedom marches, and the insistent cry, "Freedom now," black Americans and their white allies risked physical and economic retribution to lay claim to freedom. Their courage inspired a host of other challenges to the status quo, including a student movement known as the New Left, the second wave of feminism, and activism among a whole host of other minorities. By the time the decade ended, all of these movements had challenged the 1950s understanding of freedom, linked to the Cold War abroad and consumer choice at home. They made American society confront the fact that certain groups, including students, women, members of racial minorities, and homosexuals, felt themselves excluded from the full enjoyment of American freedom. With the sit-ins, college students for the first time stepped onto the stage of American history as the leading force for social change. In April 1960, the veteran civil rights organizer Ella Baker, who we have in this photo, called a meeting of young activists in Raleigh, North Carolina. It was out of this gathering that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC, or as they were more frequently known, just SNCC. The new student organization dedicated itself to replacing the culture of segregation with what they called a beloved community of racial justice, and to empowering ordinary blacks to take control of the decisions that affected their lives. In 1961, another civil rights organization, the Congress of Racial Equality, or CORE, launched what we know as the Freedom Rides. Integrated groups traveled by bus into the Deep South to test compliance with court orders banning segregation on interstate buses and trains and in terminal facilities. Here we have a couple of images of the Freedom Riders. The first shows the routes that they traveled. And the second one here is some of the signs that they displayed on their way down south, which made it pretty clear what their demands were. Violent mobs assaulted them. Near Anniston, Alabama, as we can see in the next couple of images, a firebomb was thrown into one of the buses, and the passengers were beaten as they escaped the flames. This next photograph demonstrates the attitude of the Anniston, Alabama Police Department of the time, which either aided the assaults or did nothing to protect the Freedom Riders. In Birmingham, Alabama, Klansmen attacked the student activists with bats and chains while police stood by and watched. Still, the Interstate Commerce Commission ordered buses and terminals desegregated. As the protests escalated, so too did the resistance of local white authorities. In September 1962, a court ordered the University of Mississippi to admit James Meredith, a black student, who we see in this photo. The state police watched as a mob, encouraged by the state governor, Ross Barnett, rampaged through the streets of Oxford, where the campus was located. Here's a picture of Governor Barnett waving his rebel flag. 2 bystanders lost their lives in the rioting. President Kennedy was forced to dispatch the U.S. Army to restore order in Oxford. Here we have a few images from the events showing the angry white mobs. And here the moment when Kennedy sent in the troops to finally put an end to the violence and arrest the worst offenders. The high point of protest came in 1963, when demonstrations took place in towns and cities across the South. In just 1 week in June, there were more than 15,000 arrests in 186 cities. The dramatic culmination came in Birmingham, Alabama, a virtual citadel of segregation. Even for the Deep South, Birmingham was a violent city. There'd been over 50 bombings of black homes and institutions there since World War II. Local leaders invited Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to come to the city. He was quickly arrested for violating a ban on demonstrations and sentenced to a 9-day jail term that April. It was from his cell, serving this time, that King, seen here in one of the most famous photographs of him, composed one of his most eloquent pleas for racial justice. The letter from Birmingham jail. Responding to local clergymen who counseled patients, King related the litany of abuses faced by black Southerners, from police brutality to the daily humiliation of having to explain to their children why they could not enter amusement parks or public swimming pools. The so-called white moderate, King declared, must put aside fear of disorder and commit himself to racial justice. In May, King made the bold decision to send black school children into the streets of Birmingham. Police Chief Eugene Bull Connor, seen here in this image, true to his infamous reputation, unleashed his forces against the thousands of young marchers. The images broadcast on television of children being assaulted with nightsticks, high-pressure fire hoses, and attack dogs produced a wave of revulsion throughout the world. Here we see some of the sights from what was called the Birmingham Children's March of May 1963. March began peacefully enough. People's hopes were really high. See some of the signs that these kids were carrying. And the moments when things turned violent. These images made the covers of magazines, newspapers, and were splashed all over television screens, literally across the globe. The international reaction to the brutality in Alabama led President Kennedy to start finally to publicly endorse some of the goals of the civil rights movement. Leading businessmen in Alabama, fearing rightly that Birmingham was becoming nothing more than a worldwide symbol of brutality, brokered an end to the demonstrations that desegregated downtown stores and restaurants and promised that black salespeople would start to be hired. The next month, in June, a sniper killed the field secretary of the NAACP in Mississippi and a World War II veteran, Medgar Evers. Here we have a photo of Evers and the massive funeral procession for him held in Jackson, and which again was carried on television for the whole world to see. That September 1963, a bomb exploded at a Black Baptist church in Birmingham, killing 4 young girls. Here we see the impact of the explosion from the outside. And here we see the gutted remains of the building. and the young, innocent victims. On August 28th, 1963, 2 weeks before the Birmingham church bombing, 250,000 black and white Americans converged on the nation's capital for what became known as the March on Washington, often considered the high point of the nonviolent civil rights movement. Calls for the passage of a civil rights bill pending before Congress took center stage, but the march's goals also included a public works program to reduce unemployment, an increase in the minimum wage, and a law barring discrimination in employment. These demands and the marchers' slogan, "Jobs and Freedom," revealed how the black movement had, at least for the moment, forged an alliance with white liberal groups. Here we have some of the amazing images from the March on Washington. Long views looking down the National Plaza. And one of Dr. King, moments before delivering his "I Have a Dream" speech. The movement at this point was not without internal tensions. The march organizers had to convince the SNCC leader, John Lewis, seen here at the event, to tone down his speech, the original text of which called on blacks to free ourselves of the chains of political and economic slavery, and, in Lewis's words, march through the heart of Dixie the way Sherman did and burn Jim Crow to the ground. Lewis's rhetoric forecast the more militant turn many in the movement would soon be taking. Civil rights activists also resurrected the Civil War-era vision of national authority as the custodian of American freedom. Despite the fact that the federal government had for many decades promoted segregation, blacks' historical experience suggested that they had much more hope for justice from national power than from local governments or civic institutions still riddled with racism. It still remained unclear at the end of 1963 whether the federal government would take up this responsibility. John F. Kennedy served as president for less than 3 years, and in domestic affairs had few tangible accomplishments. But his administration is widely viewed today as a moment of youthful vigor, glamour, soaring hopes, and dynamic leadership at home and abroad. Kennedy's inaugural address of January 1961, from which we have an image here, announced a watershed in American politics. The torch has been passed, he declared, to a new generation of Americans who would pay any price, bear any burden to assure the survival and success of liberty. Even though the sit-ins were by now a year old, Kennedy's speech said nothing about segregation or race. At the outset of his presidency, JFK regarded civil rights as a distraction from his main concern, vigorous conduct of the Cold War. Kennedy's agenda envisioned new initiatives aimed at countering communist influence in the world. One of his first acts was to create the Peace Corps, which sent young Americans abroad to aid in the economic and educational progress of developing countries and to improve the image of the United States there. When the Soviets in April 1961 launched a satellite carrying the first man into orbit around the Earth, Kennedy announced that the United States would mobilize its resources to land a man on the moon by the end of the decade. Like his predecessors, Kennedy viewed the entire world through the lens of the Cold War. This outlook shaped his dealings with Fidel Castro, who led a revolution in 1959 that ousted the Cuban dictator Fulgencio Batista. Here we have a photo of Castro. Until he took power in 1959, Cuba was an economic dependency of the United States. When Castro's government began nationalizing American landholdings and other investments and signed an agreement to sell sugar to the Soviet Union, the Eisenhower administration suspended trade with the island. The CIA began training anti-Castro exiles for an invasion of Cuba. In April 1961, Kennedy allowed the CIA to launch its invasion at a site known as the Bay of Pigs. But the assault proved to be a total failure and only strengthened Cuba's ties to the Soviet Union. Here we have a few images from the Bay of Pigs. First, one of the counterattack by Castro's forces. And here we have some of the exiles who were captured in the brief fighting. And finally, Castro's troops celebrating the failed invasion. The Kennedy administration tried other methods, including assassination attempts, to get rid of Castro's government, all of which obviously failed. Meanwhile, relations between the two superpowers in the Cold War deteriorated. In August 1961, in order to stem a growing tide of immigrants fleeing from East to West Berlin, the Soviets constructed a wall separating the two parts of the city. Here we have a photograph taken during the construction of the Berlin Wall, as it came to be known. Until it was finally demolished in 1989, the Berlin Wall stood as a tangible symbol of the Cold War and the division of Europe. Here we see the wall as it looked in 1989, just before its demolition, with the Brandenburg Gate in the background at the bottom left of the image. The most dangerous crisis of the Kennedy administration, and in many ways of the entire Cold War, came in October 1962, when American spy planes discovered that the Soviet Union was installing missiles in Cuba, capable of reaching the United States with nuclear weapons. Here we see one of the aerial photos that were presented to Kennedy, proving the missile's existence on the island. Rejecting advice from military leaders that he authorize an attack on Cuba, which would almost certainly have triggered a Soviet response in Berlin, and perhaps a nuclear war, Kennedy opted instead for a blockade or quarantine of the island, and demanded the missiles' removal. After tense, behind-the-scenes negotiations, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev agreed to withdraw the weapons. Here we see the two leaders meeting together. Kennedy pledged that the U.S. would not invade Cuba, and secretly agreed to remove American Jupiter missiles from Turkey, from which they could reach the Soviet Union. The crisis seems to have lessened Kennedy's passion for the Cold War. He was taken aback by the casual way military leaders spoke of winning a nuclear exchange with the Soviets. one where, of course, tens of millions of Americans and Russians were certain to die. In 1963, he called for greater cooperation with Russia. That summer, the two superpowers agreed to a treaty banning the testing of nuclear weapons in the atmosphere and in space. In his first 2 years in office, JFK was preoccupied with foreign policy. But in 1963, the crisis over civil rights eclipsed other concerns. Until then, Kennedy had been reluctant to take a forceful stand on black demands. He used federal force when obstruction of civil rights law became acute, as at the University of Mississippi, but he failed to protect activists from violence, insisting that law enforcement was a local matter. Events in Birmingham in May 1963 forced Kennedy's hand. In June, he went on national television to call for the passage of a law banning discrimination in all places of public accommodation, a major goal of the civil rights movement. The nation, he asserted, faced a moral crisis. As he stated, "We preach freedom around the world, but are we to say to the world, and much more importantly, to each other, that this is a land of the free, except for Negroes?" Kennedy did not live to see his civil rights bill enacted. On November 22nd, while riding in the motorcade we see here through Dallas, Texas, he was assassinated. JFK's death brought an abrupt and utterly unexpected end to his presidency. It fell to his successor, Lyndon B. Johnson, to secure passage of the Civil Rights Bill and to launch a program of domestic liberalism far more ambitious than anything Kennedy had envisioned. Here we see Johnson taking the oath of office on board Air Force One in the wake of Kennedy's murder, with Jackie Kennedy somehow standing next to him, offering encouragement. Unlike JFK, who was raised in a wealthy and powerful family, Lyndon Johnson grew up in one of the poorest parts of the United States, the hill country of central Texas. Johnson never forgot the poor Mexican and white children he'd taught in a Texas school in the early 1930s. Far more interested than Kennedy in domestic reform, he continued to hold the New Deal view that government had an obligation to assist less fortunate members of society. Just 5 days after Kennedy's assassination, Johnson called on Congress to enact the Civil Rights Bill as the most fitting memorial to his slain predecessor. In 1964, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, which prohibited racial discrimination in employment, institutions like hospitals and schools, and privately owned public accommodations such as restaurants, hotels, and theaters. It also banned discrimination on the grounds of sex, a provision added by opponents of civil rights in an effort to derail the entire bill, and embraced by liberal and female members of Congress as a way to broaden its scope. Here we have an image of LBJ signing the Civil Rights Act and handing the pen to Dr. King to keep as a personal gift. Johnson knew that many whites opposed the new law. After he signed it, he turned to an aide and remarked, "I think we just delivered the South to the Republican Party." The 1964 law did not address a major concern of the civil rights movement, and that was the right to vote in the South. That summer, a coalition of civil rights groups launched a voter registration drive in Mississippi. Hundreds of white college students from the North some of whom we see in this photograph, traveled to the state to take part in what became known as Freedom Summer. An outpouring of violence greeted the campaign, including 35 bombings and numerous beatings of civil rights workers. In June, 3 young activists, who we see in this image, Michael Schwerner and Andrew Goodman, white students from the North, and James Chaney, a local black youth, were kidnapped by a deputy sheriff who was also a Klansman, along with his posse, and murdered near Philadelphia, Mississippi. Although many black lives had been lost in the movement, the deaths of the 2 white students now focused unprecedented attention on Mississippi and on the apparent inability of the federal government to protect citizens seeking to exercise their constitutional rights. Freedom Summer led directly to one of the most dramatic confrontations of the civil rights era, the campaign by the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, or MFDP, to take the seats of the state's all-white official party at the 1964 Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey. In this image, we see some of the student volunteers meeting with local people, trying to get them to put their names on petitions, something that put them all at risk, the students and the local people, who would still be there long after the students left at the end of the summer. The civil rights movement in Mississippi had created the Freedom Democratic Party, open to all residents of the state. Here we see some of the MFDP delegates at the convention hall in Atlantic City that year. At televised hearings before the DNC Credentials Committee, Fannie Lou Hamer, one of the leaders of the party, who we see here as she appeared on television, held a national audience absolutely spellbound with her account of growing up in poverty in the Yazoo, Mississippi Delta, and of the savage beatings she endured at the hands of police. Party liberals, including Johnson's running mate, Hubert Humphrey, who we see again here, tried to press for a compromise at the convention that would allow for the seating of 2 black so-called at-large delegates. The MFDP rejected the proposal. As Fannie Lou Hamer declared, "We didn't come all this way for no 2 seats." The events at Atlantic City severely weakened black activists' faith in the responsiveness of the political system and forecast the impending breakup of the coalition between the civil rights movement and the liberal wing of the Democratic Party. For the moment, however, the movement rallied behind Johnson's campaign for re-election. LBJ's opponent, who we see in this photo, Senator Barry Goldwater of Arizona, demanded a much more aggressive conduct of the Cold War. But Goldwater directed most of his critique against internal dangers to freedom, especially the New Deal welfare state, which he believed stifled individual initiative and independence. He voted against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. Stigmatized by the Democrats as an extremist who would repeal Social Security and risk nuclear war, Goldwater went down to a disastrous defeat. Johnson received almost 43 million votes to Goldwater's 27 million. Democrats swept to 2-to-1 majorities in both houses of Congress. But Goldwater's message enabled him to carry 5 Deep South states, and segregationist governor George Wallace of Alabama showed in several Democratic primaries that politicians could strike electoral gold by appealing to white opposition to the civil rights movement. Although few realized it at the time, the 1964 campaign marked a milestone in the resurgence of American conservatism. Here we have an image of George Wallace, the governor of Alabama. The 1960s, today recalled as a decade of radicalism, clearly had a conservative side as well. Goldwater brought new constituencies to the conservative cause. His campaign aroused enthusiasm in the rapidly expanding suburbs of Southern California, many of whose residents had recently arrived from the East and the Midwest and worked in defense-related industries. Southern California became a nationally known center of grassroots conservative activism. And by carrying 5 states of the Deep South, Goldwater showed that the Civil Rights Revolution had redrawn the nation's political map, opening the door to a so-called Southern strategy that would eventually lead the entire region into the Republican Party. Well before the rise of Black Power, a reaction against civil rights gains offered conservatives new opportunities and threatened the stability of the Democratic coalition. During the 60s, most conservatives abandoned talk of racial superiority and inferiority. But conservative appeals to law and order, to what they characterized as freedom of association, and the evils of welfare, had strong racial overtones. Racial divisions proved to be a political gold mine for conservatives, as we know all too well today. As the middle of the decade approached, one last legislative triumph lay ahead for the civil rights movement. In January 1965, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. launched a voting rights campaign in Selma, Alabama, a city where only 355 of 15,000 black residents had been allowed to register to vote. In March, defying a ban by Governor George Wallace, King attempted to lead a march from Selma to the state capital, Montgomery. Here we have again the picture of George Wallace, and right after, an image from the very beginning of the march, which, started peacefully enough. But signs quickly pointed to an ominous outcome as the governor's forces started to close in on the marchers, an idea of which we can get from this photograph. When the marchers reached the bridge leading out of the city, state police began assaulting them with cattle prods, whips, and tear gas. Here we have some of the images of the violence in Selma. First one here shows the police approaching the march leaders on the bridge, including John Lewis of SNCC in the white coat on the right of the photograph. The next captures the moment when Lewis and his colleagues were beaten by the police. And here we see the release of tear gas into the ranks of the marchers. And this last image here shows John Lewis of SNCC. Today, of course, he's a congressman from Atlanta, laying on the ground after the assault that he'd endured at the hands of the police. Once again, violence against non-violent demonstrators flashed across television screens throughout the world, calling Selma a milestone in man's unending search for freedom. LBJ, Lyndon Johnson, asked Congress to enact a law securing the right to vote. He closed his speech by quoting the Civil Rights Movement's song, "We Shall Overcome." Never before had the movement received so powerful an endorsement from the federal government. Congress quickly passed what became known as the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which allowed federal officials to register voters rather than state officials. In addition, the 24th Amendment to the Constitution outlawed the poll tax, which had long prevented poor blacks and even some whites from voting in the South. By 1965, the civil rights movement had succeeded in eradicating the legal basis of second-class citizenship. The belief that racism should no longer serve as a premise for public policy spilled over into other realms. That same year, what's known as the Hart-Celler Act abandoned the national origins quota system of immigration, which had excluded Asians and severely restricted Southern and Eastern Europeans. Here we see LBJ signing the bill into law in New York underneath the Statue of Liberty. The law established new, racially neutral criteria for immigration, notably family reunification and possession of skills in demand in the United States. On the other hand, because of growing hostility in the Southwest to Mexican immigration, the law established the first limit, 120,000, on newcomers from the Western Hemisphere. The new law ended up having many unexpected results. At the time, immigrants represented only 5% of the American population, the lowest proportion since the 1830s. No one anticipated that the new quotas would lead to an explosive rise in immigration, or that a dramatic shift would take place, where newcomers from Latin America, the Caribbean, and Asia would outnumber those coming from Europe to the United States. Taken together, the Civil Rights Revolution and immigration reform marked the triumph of a pluralist conception of Americanism. After his landslide victory of 1964, LBJ outlined the most sweeping proposal for governmental action to promote the general welfare since the New Deal. Johnson's initiatives of 1965 to 1967, known collectively as the Great Society, provided health services to the poor and to the elderly in the new Medicaid and Medicare programs, and it poured federal funds into education and urban development. New agencies, such as the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the National Endowments for the Humanities and the Arts, and a national public broadcasting network were created. These measures greatly expanded the powers of the federal government, and they completed and extended the social agenda, minus a system of national health insurance that had been stalled in Congress since 1938. Unlike the New Deal, however, the Great Society was a response to prosperity, not depression. The mid-1960s were a time of rapid economic expansion, fueled by increased government spending and a tax cut on individuals and businesses initially proposed by Kennedy. Johnson and Democratic liberals believed that economic growth made it possible to fund ambitious new government programs and to improve the quality of life for all Americans. The centerpiece of LBJ's Great Society, though, was the so-called War on Poverty. Here we see him campaigning for the program in early 1964. During the 1930s, Democrats had attributed poverty to an imbalance of economic power and flawed economic institutions. In the 1960s, the Johnson administration attributed it to an absence of skills and a lack of proper attitudes and work habits. As a result, the War on Poverty did not address the economic changes that were reducing the number of well-paid manufacturing jobs and leaving poor families in rural areas like Appalachia and decaying urban ghettos with little hope of economic advancement. One of the Great Society's most popular and successful components, food stamps, did offer direct aid to the poor. But in general, the War on Poverty concentrated not on direct economic aid, but on equipping the poor with skills and rebuilding their spirit and motivation. It provided Head Start, an early childhood education program, along with job training, legal services, and scholarships for poor college students. Recognizing that black poverty was fundamentally different from white, Johnson sought to redefine the relationship between freedom and equality. LBJ's Great Society may not have achieved equality, but it represented the most expansive effort in the nation's history to mobilize the powers of the national government to address the needs of the least advantaged Americans. Coupled with the decade's high rate of economic growth, the War on Poverty succeeded in reducing the incidence of poverty from 22% to 13% of American families over the course of the 60s. It's fluctuated at around that figure ever since. By the 1990s, thanks to the Civil Rights Movement and the Great Society, the historic gap between whites and blacks in education, income, and access to skilled employment narrowed. But nearly a quarter of all black children still lived in poverty. In the mid-1960s, economic issues rose to the forefront of the civil rights agenda. Violent outbreaks in black ghettos outside the South drew attention to the national scope of racial injustice and to inequalities in jobs, education, and housing that the dismantling of legal segregation left intact. The first riots, really battles between angry blacks and mostly white police, erupted in Harlem in 1964. Here we have a couple of images from the rioting in Harlem. The first showing police assaulting an unarmed man on the sidewalk. And the second, a child bravely staring down police who apparently cannot look him in the eyes. Far larger than the disturbance in Harlem was the infamous Watts Uprising of 1965, which took place in the black ghetto of Los Angeles only days after Johnson had signed the Voting Rights Act into law. An estimated 50,000 persons took part in the riot, attacking police and firemen, looting white-owned businesses, and burning buildings. It required 15,000 police and National Guardsmen to restore order, by which time 35 people had laid dead, 900 injured, and $30 million worth of property had been destroyed. Here we have a few images from Watts in 1965 that show how devastating the violence and destruction was. By the summer of 1967, urban uprisings had left 23 dead in Newark, New Jersey, and 43 dead in Detroit, Michigan, where entire blocks went up in flames and property damage ran into the hundreds of millions of dollars. The urban riots led LBJ to appoint a commission, headed by then Illinois Governor Otto Kerner, to study the causes of urban unrest. Released in 1968, the Kerner Report blamed the violence on segregation and poverty and offered a powerful indictment of white racism. But the report failed to offer any clear proposals for change. With black unemployment twice that of whites and the average black family income little more than half the white norm, the movement looked for ways to make freedom real for black Americans. In 1964, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. called for a Bill of Rights for the disadvantaged, to mobilize the nation's resources to abolish economic deprivation. His proposal was directed against poverty in general, but King also insisted that after, in his words, doing something special against the Negro for hundreds of years, the United States had an obligation to do something for him now. It was an early call for what would come to be known as affirmative action. In 1966, King launched the Chicago Freedom Movement, with demands quite different from its predecessors in the South. Here we see MLK in Chicago at the time. He called for an end to discrimination by employers and labor unions, equal access to mortgages, the integration of public housing, and the construction of low-income housing scattered across the region. The problem was that in the Windy City, King was going up against the entrenched political power of Mayor Richard J. Daley's political machine. Here we see an image of the Mayor Daley. He also was facing the ferocious opposition of white homeowners in Chicago. To make a long story short, King's northern version of the freedom movement got nowhere in the end. The civil rights movement's first phase had produced a clear set of objectives, far-reaching accomplishments, and a series of coherent, if sometimes competitive, organizations. The second phase witnessed political fragmentation and few significant victories. Even during the heyday of the integration struggle, the fiery orator Malcolm X, who we see here, had insisted that blacks must control the political and economic resources of their own communities and rely on their own efforts rather than working with whites. He became a spokesman for the Nation of Islam, or Black Muslims, and a sharp critic of the ideas of integration and nonviolence. On a 1964 trip to Mecca, Saudi Arabia, though, Islam's spiritual home, Malcolm X witnessed harmony among Muslims of all races. Upon his return to the U.S., he tentatively started to speak about the possibility of interracial cooperation to produce radical change in America. But when members of the Nation of Islam assassinated him in February 1965, after he'd broken away and formed his own Organization of Afro-American Unity, Malcolm X left neither a consistent ideology nor a coherent movement behind. However, his call for blacks to rely on their own resources struck a chord among the urban poor and younger civil rights activists. Malcolm X was the intellectual father of what we know as Black Power in the 1960s. It was a slogan that came to national attention in 1966 when the SNCC leader, Stokely Carmichael, who we see in this photo, used it during a civil rights march in Mississippi. A highly imprecise idea, Black Power suggested everything from the election of more black officials to the belief that black Americans were a colonized people whose freedom could only be won through a revolutionary struggle for self-determination. But no matter how employed, the idea reflected the radicalization of young civil rights activists and sparked an explosion of racial self-assertion, captured in the phrase, "Black is beautiful." The abandonment of the word Negro in favor of Afro-American, as well as the popularity of African styles of dress and the natural or Afro hairdo among both men and women, reflected a new sense of racial pride and a rejection of white norms. Inspired by the idea of black self-determination, SNCC and CORE repudiated their previous interracialism, and new militant groups sprang into existence. The most prominent of the new groups in terms of publicity, if not numbers, was the Black Panther Party. Founded in Oakland, California in 1966, it became notorious for advocating the armed self-defense of black communities in response to police brutality. The party's youthful members alarmed whites by wearing military garb and sometimes carrying guns in public. Here we have a couple of images of the Panthers. First, a men's group. And a women's group. Less known, and certainly less publicized by the white press of the time, or even now for that matter, was the fact that the BPP, the Black Panther Party, also ran things like health clinics, schools, as we see some Panther children attending class in this photograph, and things like breakfast programs in poor communities. Ultimately, internal disputes, and more significantly, a campaign against the BPP by the police and the FBI, which left several leaders dead in shootouts, destroyed the organization. Here in this photo we see from right to left Huey Newton and Bobby Seale, the co-founders of the Black Panther Party. By 1967, with the escalation of U.S. military involvement in Vietnam, the war on poverty had ground to a halt. By then, with ghetto uprisings punctuating the urban landscape, the anti-war movement assuming massive proportions, and millions of young people ostentatiously rejecting mainstream values, American society faced its greatest crisis since the Great Depression. To most Americans, the rise of a protest movement among white youth came as a complete surprise. If blacks' grievances appeared self-evident by this point, those of white college students were difficult to understand. What persuaded large numbers of children of affluence to reject the values and institutions of their society? In part, the answer lay in a redefinition of the meaning of freedom by what came to be called the New Left. The New Left challenged not only mainstream America, but also what it dismissively referred to as the Old Left. Unlike the Communist Party, the New Left did not take the Soviet Union as a model, or see the working class as the main agent of social change. Instead of economic equality, the language of New Deal liberals, the New Left spoke of loneliness, isolation, and alienation, of powerlessness in the face of bureaucratic institutions, and a hunger for authenticity that affluence simply could not provide. By 1968, thanks to the coming of age of the baby boom generation and the growing numbers of jobs that required post-high school skills, more than 7 million students attended college, more than the number of farmers or steel workers. The New Left's greatest inspiration was the Black Freedom Movement. More than any other event, the sit-ins catalyzed white student activism. Here was the unlikely brew that created the upheaval known as the Sixties, the convergence of society's most excluded members demanding full access to all its benefits, along with the children of the middle class rejecting the social mainstream. The years 1962 and 1963 had witnessed the appearance of several path-breaking books that challenged one or another aspect of the 1950s consensus. Here we have a photograph of James Baldwin. His work, The Fire Next Time, gave angry voice to the Black Revolution. Rachel Carson, captured in this image, exposed the environmental costs of economic growth in her work, Silent Spring. Michael Harrington, seen here in a work called The Other America, revealed the persistence of poverty amid plenty. And in The Death and Life of Great American Cities, Jane Jacobs, who we have here in this image, criticized urban renewal, the removal of the poor from city centers, and the destruction of neighborhoods to build highways. Yet in some ways the most influential critique of all arose in 1962 from the organization known as Students for a Democratic Society, or SDS. Meeting at Port Huron, Michigan, some 60 college students adopted a document that captured the mood and summarized the beliefs of this generation of student protesters. The Port Huron statement, from which we have an image here, offered a new vision of social change. We seek the establishment, it proclaimed, of a democracy of individual participation, in which the individual shares in those social decisions determining the quality and direction of his life. Freedom for the New Left meant what they called participatory democracy. Although rarely defined with precision, this became a standard by which students came to judge existing social arrangements, workplaces, schools, government, and found them wanting. In 1964, events at the University of California, Berkeley, revealed the possibility for a mobilization of students in the name of participatory democracy. Berkeley was an immense, impersonal institution where enrollments in many classes approached 1,000 students. The spark that set student protests alight was a rule prohibiting political groups from using a central area of the campus to spread their ideas. Students responded by creating the free speech movement. Thousands of Berkeley students became involved in the protests in the months that followed. Here we have a couple of images from them. The first captures Mario Savio, one of the leaders of the movement, atop a police vehicle, addressing the mass of students with a bullhorn. And the second gives us a better look at him during another one of the demonstrations. The students' program moved from demanding a repeal of the new rule to a critique of the entire structure of the university and of an education geared toward preparing graduates simply for corporate jobs and almost nothing else. The university gave in on the speech ban in early 1965. By then, the Black Freedom Movement and the emergence of the New Left had shattered the climate of consensus that dominated the 1950s. But what transformed protest into a full-fledged generational rebellion was the war in Vietnam. The conflict tragically revealed the danger that Walter Lippmann had warned of at the outset of the Cold War, viewing the entire world and every local situation within it through the either-or lens of an anti-communist crusade. The Truman and Eisenhower administrations had cast their lot with French colonialism in the region. After the French defeat, they financed the creation of a pro-American South Vietnamese government. By the 1960s, the U.S. was committed to the survival of this corrupt regime. Fear that the public would not forgive them for losing Vietnam made it impossible for Presidents Kennedy and Johnson to remove the United States from an increasingly untenable situation. JFK's foreign policy advisors saw Vietnam as a test of whether the U.S. could, through what was called counterinsurgency, that is, intervention to counter internal uprisings in non-communist countries, halt the spread of Third World revolutions. LBJ came to the presidency with little experience in foreign relations, but he knew that Republicans had used the so-called loss of China as a weapon against Truman. In August 1964, North Vietnamese vessels encountered an American ship on a spy mission off its coast. When North Vietnamese patrol boats fired on the American vessel, Johnson proclaimed that the United States was a victim of aggression. In response, Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, authorizing the president to take all necessary measures to repel armed attack in Vietnam. In this image, we see LBJ signing the resolution. Over 40 years later, in December 2005, the National Security Agency finally released hundreds of pages of secret documents that made it clear no North Vietnamese attack had ever actually occurred. The story was all a complete lie to the American people and the world. Immediately after Johnson's 1964 election, the National Security Council recommended that the United States begin airstrikes against North Vietnam and introduce American ground troops in the South. LBJ put the plan into effect. By 1968, the number of American troops in Vietnam exceeded 500,000, and the conduct of the war had become more and more brutal. The North Vietnamese mistreated American prisoners of war held in a camp known sardonically by the inmates as the Hanoi Hilton. Here we see an aerial photograph of the camp. American planes, like we see in this image, dropped more tons of bombs on the small countries of North and South Vietnam than both sides had used in all of World War II. They also spread chemicals that destroyed forests to deprive the Viet Cong of hiding places, and dropped bombs, as we can see in this photograph, filled with napalm, a gelatinous form of gasoline that burns the skin of anyone exposed to it. Here in this image we see Vietnamese fleeing an American napalm attack during the war. And in this image, the horrific and cruel damage caused by napalm. As casualties mounted and American bombs poured down on North and South Vietnam, the Cold War foreign policy of consensus began to unravel. By 1968, the war had sidetracked much of the Great Society and had torn families, universities, and the Democratic Party apart. Opposition to the war became the organizing theme that unified people with all kinds of doubts and discontents. With college students exempted from the draft, the burden of fighting fell on the working class and the poor, as it does in almost all wars. In 1967, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. condemned the Johnson administration's Vietnam policy as an unconscionable use of violence and for draining resources from needs at home. At this point, King was the most prominent American to speak out against the war. As for SDS, the war seemed the exact opposite of participatory democracy, since American involvement had come through secret commitments and decisions made by political elites with no real public debate. In April 1965, SDS invited opponents of American policy in Vietnam to assemble in Washington, D.C. The turnout of 25,000 amazed the organizers, offering the first hint that the anti-war movement would soon enjoy a mass constituency. By 1967, young men were burning their draft cards or fleeing to Canada to avoid fighting in what they considered an unjust war. In October of that year, 100,000 anti-war protesters assembled at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., as we can see in this image. And massive anti-war rallies occurred at the same time in New York City, as we can see in this photo, held just outside the United Nations building in New York. And in San Francisco, captured in this image along the famous Haight-Ashbury Street. After the October 1967 anti-war protest in front of the Lincoln Memorial, many of the student protesters marched across the Potomac River to the Pentagon, where photographers, as we can see in these photographs, captured them placing flowers in the rifle barrels of the soldiers standing guard over the nerve center of the conflict in Vietnam. The New Left's definition of freedom initially centered on participatory democracy, which was a political concept. But as the 1960s progressed, young Americans' understanding of freedom increasingly expanded to include cultural freedom as well. By the late 60s, millions of young people openly rejected the values and behavior of their elders. For the first time in American history, the flamboyant rejection of norms in clothing, language, sexual behavior, and drug use, previously confined to artists and bohemians, became the basis of a mass movement. Its rallying cry was the concept of liberation. Here in our last couple of images, we see some of the notorious hippies of the era. In some ways, what we call the counterculture of the 1960s represented not rebellion, but the fulfillment of the consumer marketplace. In this important sense, it extended into every realm of life the definition of freedom as the right to individual choice. Self-indulgence and self-destructive behavior, of course, were built into the counterculture, but the movement resulted in far more than just that by the end of the decade. Okay, so next time we'll finish off our narrative covering a century of American history with a look at the chaos that was the year 1968, the end of the 60s, the Vietnam War, and the Nixon years in the White House, culminating in the corruption of power scandal that we know as Watergate.